เริ่มไหมครับ Okay. สวัสดีครับ Good morning from ISIS Thailand in Bangkok, in central Bangkok. Welcome to our webinar this morning on 1 year after the coup in Myanmar. And we're looking at the realities, the trends, the prospects. It's been an incredible year that, in 1 year, Myanmar has gone from a decade of reform and opening and progress, even though limited, even though mixed, to a dark autocratic dictatorship under military rule within this past year is still incredible to many of us. I think that there are a lot of questions, there'll be a lot of events marking this 1 year anniversary of the coup. Normally anniversaries are celebrated, but I think that this one is not being celebrated widely. Even I think the military may not be celebrating it either, because the Myanmar military is having a hard time imposing control over the country. We have a lineup of expert speakers, people who've been involved in these issues and on Myanmar, tracking Myanmar, studying, analyzing, researching Myanmar. We will also talk about Myanmar in the broader regional context, international arena, and see where that all fits. So I'll just introduce very briefly our speakers. We'll start with Kinoma. Kinoma has been an activist. She is the head of the Progressive, founder and chairperson of Progressive Voice. It's a Myanmar human rights research and advocacy organization. So she'll kick off, and then we will come to Dr. Matthew Arnold, who used to be a senior fellow with ISIS Thailand. He has a PhD. He's written a number of books on the conflict areas, conflict studies, including Sudan and places in Africa. He also worked in Afghanistan. He was recently, until the coup, the head of the Asia Foundation in Myanmar. And now he is the independent researcher, analyst, tracking, following events very
Recording
closely,
in progress.
On the ground. And then we'll come to Gwen Robinson, who's a journalist by training, but she's also a senior fellow with ISIS Thailand. She has been visiting Myanmar for many years until the coup, and still keep a very close eye and close tab on what's going on in the country. Recently went and visited the border area at Matsot, bordering Myanmar, so she'll share some anecdotes and stories there. And then we have Ambassador Kasipirom, who used to be the Foreign Minister of Thailand. He is now very active with the Asean Parliamentary and Human Rights Organization. He used to be ambassador to Russia, Indonesia, Germany, Japan, United States, and he's been very vocal and active in the second track, third track of ASEAN cooperation, and especially on Myanmar. So I'll just say this, I mean, going back almost a year ago to this day, the military coup was, I think it, by all accounts, it took many of us by surprise. And there was a decade-long political liberalizations, economic reforms, and some development progress. There were some issues and challenges, but along the way, at least after 5 decades of military dictatorship, Myanmar was opening up. There were new opportunities. It was more connected to the outside world. And I think that 1 decade made a profound difference, because when the coup was staged on February 1st last year, it was not the usual coup like in 1962 in Myanmar or 1988. The coup is incomplete. It hasn't failed, but it hasn't succeeded. The military, the Tatmadaw, has taken power, but does not quite have control over the country. There has been a nationwide revolt and an armed opposition alliance fighting the military now, fighting against military rule. And we will get some anecdotes and some data from our speakers today about where the direction of the conflict, which must be seen now as a civil war, really, civil war no less. And this civil war there are a lot of dynamics on the ground, but there have been anecdotes and reports about military desertions and maybe low morale. So on the other side, I think the civilian opposition alliance comprising, under the umbrella of the national unity government, but also comprising the ethnic armed organizations, the People's Defense Force, along with the civil disobedience movement, the CRPS as well. The opposition alliance has been, in fact, perhaps gaining ground as they receive more arms, more training. So this has become a guerrilla style attrition warfare on the ground between the one side, opposition alliance, and then the military. And the military may be overstretched, maybe outmanned a little bit, even though the opposition is outgunned. Of course, the military has air power. They can conduct airstrikes at will. So on the ground it's a horrible situation. A lot of violence, and I think we have an NGO. I think the Assistant Association for Political Prisoners. The latest figure is almost 1,500 have died, and thousands have been arrested, and many more on the run. So on the ground, that's what we have. And then ASEAN in the neighborhood. ASEAN, in reaction to the coup, it took some time to finally come up with a 5-point consensus chaired by Brunei at that time in April last year. But now the ASEAN chairmanship has turned over to Cambodia based on a alphabetical rotational basis. And Prime Minister Hun Sen has recently visited Senior General Min Aung Hlaing in Myanmar. And this has been very controversial because it was done without consultation with other ASEAN governments. So ASEAN has not been effective in implementing the 5-point consensus, which came even a bit late, but nevertheless, it was something to work with. In the international community beyond, they have deferred. I think the UN has deferred to ASEAN to mediate, to broker a dialogue. And then you have China, I think initially not happy with the coup, but China will not abandon the Myanmar military. The Russians have been selling more arms, and we even have seen the Iranians involved on the military side. So the major powers outside are kind of waded in. ASEAN has been ineffective. So the Myanmar people, I think this is a fight for themselves on their own. And I think that the fight, the civil war, will decide the fate of the country, where it will go. And it could be some time. So that's a broad kind of very broad and nutshell update, but there are a lot of nuances, a lot of dynamics, and we'll be looking at the realities, the trends, and maybe what we can expect moving forward. I'll just invite first Kinoma. Omar, I know you have, this is your life's work, Myanmar opening and now shut down again. Maybe you can share with us, based on your sources, your own views, background analysis, and maybe a feel for where things are and where the situation is moving. Omar?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ajahn Titinan, and also thanks to CSIS ISIS Thailand for organizing this and also having me join this distinguished panel. I would like to give some updates from the ground, but also before that, I would like to just listening to you in the introduction. You're right. Actually, the military junta is not succeeding yet. That this first anniversary on February 1 coming up is, like you said, anniversary is to actually celebrate. But for the military, it's very clearly that's not the celebration for them. But I think on the, what I can say for sure on the people side, there's so much immense suffering on the ground, but also there is a lot to celebrate, that I would say. Because our country's history was such a long decades for many times of the military rule or the military dictatorship, successive regimes in the past. This is the first time ever that people have been able to gain so much ground to in resisting the military's attempted coup to control the country, but also with a very firm determination and also setting out a clear vision of the country, which again that's never happened before. Like you said, also yes, for me being a veteran activist for so long, since I was involved organizing the 1988 democracy uprising in 1988. So that's already over 30 years. So throughout my activism life, I have never seen such level of this a solid grounded people's movement with so much of the creativities, so much of the also joined by the different generations. Again, this is something that we didn't see it back in 1988. When we were involved, our parents and elder generations were all telling us not to do, not to resist this military, right? But now is when the children are resisting or joining the movement, the parents are already either joining or supporting. And it's very, very different landscape in our country that has never seen in the past. Also, one thing that I want to say is that this resistance is also with the that one something come out very, very significant and really give so much hope for our country to move forward beyond this military. That is the solidarity among the people. I mean, as you know well, the Burma, Myanmar is ethnically very diverse. And also throughout the country's history, there's been this armed conflicts or low intensified civil war between the successive Burma-dominated military regimes and the ethnic nationalities, communities who have been fighting for self-determination and ethnic equality for so long. And but the Burma majority that I belong to, our group, our Burma community, we will resist the military, but we were never targeted as an ethnic community by the military in the past. So meaning the Burma majority never really experienced the armed conflict or such, setting the villages on fire and being shot at or air bombed, like the ethnic communities have faced in the past. But throughout the last year in this Spring Revolution, now all these communities come together to learn each other's what's happening to each other's communities. And also there are a lot more of this, solidarity learning to each other. And this military is really the center of the root causes of the people suffering in the country. And that's become very clear. So I think it's one thing, really came out very strongly that, again, this is something that I know our people will be celebrating on February 1. And also one thing that I also come to see is another good thing is the diaspora communities across the globe in many of the countries in in Europe or in US. All of these communities, if you see that many of the generations who've been outside the country of outside Burma, they have also experienced the political violence or the military's violence in the past, and they are younger generation together. They are now joining the movement from outside, from afar, from as a diaspora, supporting and contributing all they can for the people on the ground who are actually day to day, day in and day out, resisting this military. Again, this is also another very strength of the Spring Revolution. And in fact, if you really notice it, the areas where the humanitarian aid is so much needed, and these are the areas that international aid community or the UN agencies don't have access to. And it is actually the people themselves are really helping out each other and taking care of each other. In many areas, that's what's happening. When the military is continue to be blocking the aid, destroying the aid, also attacking the health workers, also the humanitarian aid workers, health facilities, it is really the people who are actually, rounding, mobilizing among themselves quietly and try to help out each other, including for the COVID-19 third wave. That's what people were doing. So it's a this sense of unity and solidarity is something that we have never seen before, and which is I see as a ground, like a foundation for Burma to move forward as a federal democratic union. And that is also very important because, again, in our time in 1988, we knew what we don't want, what we didn't want. We didn't want the military anymore, but we were not clear to set out a vision collectively for how we want to achieve for this country. We didn't have that chance. But now this young generation, they have come to set out a clear collective vision for future Myanmar that is a federal democratic union. So again, I would say with these are the positive, like really like important positive things are happening on the ground. But of course, like you said, also for the military, for them, I don't see there's nothing for them to celebrate. Is also because this institution that you never saw cracked in the past is now cracking. It's being cracked because the police and the military personnel within the institution, within the entity, are actually leaving. They are not deserting. They are actually defecting because they don't believe in that military anymore, and they are joining the people. At least like 8,000 are already joining. They already left the military. So this is also, it must be quite a desperate, like a wake up call to the military at this point. But of course, what we see is their desperateness is now also, they are showing that in their actions. And that is what really is very scary for us that we are seeing on the ground, is because you see that, like you said, according to the Assistant Association for Political Prisoners, there are already like more than about 1,500 being killed, but also more than 11,000, almost 12,000 people being arrested, more than 8,000 are in detention. Torture is a routine. So we are facing such difficult situation for those who are resisting. But at the same time, the civilians are also deliberately targeted as a collective punishment by the military for those areas where the resistance is strong. So that's why we are seeing also more of these crimes the military is committing, such as the crimes against humanity and war crimes, such as this extrajudicial killing, setting the villages on fire, setting people alive, and killing, committing mass killings. There have been a number of mass killings already happened. The children are deliberately targeted. So you see all of these extreme violence that military is applying in their desperateness, desperate to kind of like retaliate the people. So that's where things are at the moment. But I just want to in this time, especially, I think the major challenge that people from or on the ground right now is this: we are facing such entity that is like most barbaric, with no regards whatsoever to the human's life, and they have all the weapons and machineries, and particularly the airstrikes, and for the ethnic armed organizations and also the People's Defense Forces, they won't be able to resist to these airstrikes. So this is where we are very like worried of how we can stop these military's violence on the ground, particularly from the airstrike that's already forced more than in 1 year time, more than 300,000 civilians being forced out of their homes and become internally displaced, and many thousands cross the border to Thailand. Well, not really to the Thailand side, but like they are trying to, but of course, that they are not able to get cross to Thailand side. That's another major serious security problem that we are having. But just my very closing point on the update is our partner Asean Burma documented that according to ACLED, during the first 11 months of the junta's attempted coup, there were 7,686 armed clashes and attacks on civilians across the country. That is a 715% increase from the same period in 2020. In 2020, during the same time, there were 943 armed clashes and attacks. That's mostly in the ethnic areas. The intensity of the violence was comparable to Syria, which was 7,743, and greater than Afghanistan and Yemen and Iraq. So in the last 4 months of the 2021, that's between September and December, the conflict in Myanmar has escalated to outpace all of the other 4 countries who are on the Security Council agenda. And yet, the attention or the response from the Security Council continued to be nowhere to see. With that, I would just stop my update here. Ajahn, thank you very much.
Thank you, Omar. Omar, I just want to let me follow up with a very short question to you. The international attention on Myanmar is very limited, and I think the international community now is distracted and preoccupied with other issues, Russia, Ukraine, China, elsewhere, and so on. So there's not enough sustained attention to be looking at Myanmar all that much. But please give us a flavor, a feel for, you mentioned this is kind of unprecedented, and it's clearly unprecedented because, you don't see a kind of a people's fight or a people's movement against military like this at the risk of their own lives. People are willing to, very fierce movement. What is motivating, Omar? What is motivating? You mentioned that the younger people, the younger demographics. Can you tell us a little bit about these young people? Who, what are they thinking? Why are they willing to risk their lives and be killed and maimed by the military to carry out this fight? And it looks to me like the morale on the people's side and opposition alliance is still very, very high. So this is they have the collective commitment and resolve to see this through. Give us a little bit about what's the mindset of the young. What do they see, and why are they fighting back so fiercely?
This is my observation. So in the past decade, when the country opened up, especially the young generation, they have come to be like starting to taste the freedom, some sort of freedom, in that very limited opening by the military. I don't think they were that aware of how this military has not changed their agenda. Like people like myself, honestly, this coup attempt on February 1 last year was not a surprise. Many of us knew it is coming sooner or later. And also because we knew that this military has no intention of letting go of both the political and economic power, that they have already gained so much ground, that they already built this economic empire. But for the young generation, I think they had so much hope, which was, they were really like looking forward to their brighter future, and they were working so hard. Pushing the envelope, try to get, expand their democratic space, try to get education opportunity. They travel outside, they try to get education opportunity inside the country. I think there was this so much hope and enthusiasm for that brighter future where the military will actually leave. Also in that hope that they were voting, that's also the first time that they were having a chance to vote in 2015, again in 2020, and they given having a chance to vote second time, and also when the Daw Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy won landslide, overwhelming again. I think there is a collective kind of like a hope that this time the 2008 constitution, which was drafted by the military, which gave the disproportionate power to them, right? And people were hoping because during the 5 years of the National League for Democracy term, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD civilian government, they more or less, they tried to amend this constitution. Of course, they were not successful, and very clearly, why, we all know that. But I think for the young generation, when this coup was staged on February 1, it is for a few reasons. One is their votes were robbed, and the second is also that they learned from their past 10 years time from their parents and just from the generally. They knew that this military also stayed for a long time before, like so they knew, like that's why one of their slogan is we will never allow you to rule us again. And also another very strong slogan from the young generation is that military rule must end with our generation. It cannot pass on to the younger generation. So I think this aspiration for democracy and the limited freedom that they have tasted, and also seeing the brighter future with no military, I think this young generation is not going to give up. I think they are so determined because they know what is ahead for them and for their younger generations without this military. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think for people outside, looking at Myanmar, a very complicated situation and very violent. But from outside, I think what you're saying, Omar, is that basically the 1 decade of reform and opening from 2011 to 2021 coup basically has changed Myanmar profoundly, right? So the genie cannot be put back in a bottle. The cat is out of the bag, and things will never be the same again. I think the military thinks otherwise. I think that they think that they can probably turn back the clock, to the 5 decades of dictatorship from 1962. But I think the Myanmar people now, for the 1 decade of reform and opening, say that the clock can never be turned back again. Myanmar is an interesting case too, Omar. You look at Thailand, Cambodia. These are countries that the autocratic rule has got away with it, right? But Myanmar is a litmus case, I think, that here is an attempted autocracy again, but they're not getting away with it. And if the tide really turns, this could have regional and even broader implications for this battleground between democracy and autocracy. Thank you very much.
If I can just very quickly raise one other point, is the civil society, particularly the rights-based civil society and human rights defenders in Myanmar, they have worked so hard in the last 10 years. They have resisted, all the oppressive laws and all means of the military oppression. Even in the last 10 years, they were so strong and keep pushing the envelope and really work hard, and they empower the general public so much. And now in the last year, during the Spring Revolution, you see how general public is so empowered. You can see them become like a meaningful participants of the revolution rather than just like a standby and become like a regular supporter and like a sitting or standing by watching. But they have become meaningful participants of the movement. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll come back to the second round to you, Omar, and I want to talk about at that time about the opposition unity and solidarity that you mentioned, because in comparison to nearby countries, the opposition unity and solidarity will be key in achieving some forward movement in the near future. Let me move to Dr. Matt Arnold. Our audience members, participants can see, from we've provided made available the biographies, the bio data of our speakers. Dr. Matt Arnold is a very accomplished writer, researcher. He's done many, many things, so I don't have time to go into all his accomplishments. But now he's been tracking and studying the Myanmar civil war. One sign that the tide is shifting a little bit, and perhaps one sign of the military's growing desperation, is the increasing frequency of airstrikes. Because now I think the ground war, the military is losing a little bit of grip. Maybe they have a lot of guns, but maybe outmanned. Dr. Matt Arnold, Matt, can you tell us a little bit about the dynamics on the ground? I mean, it's a moving dynamic, but what's happening? And I think you have some slides to show too. Please feel free to show the maps.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for the invitation to talk today. I'd like to share some research today. This is based on work I've been doing with a colleague, Kim Jaleeves, looking at basically territorial control and local administration. So I do have some slides. If you can wait on those. I'll show those in a little bit. I'd like to make some overarching points just to describe the nature of the conflict first, because I think that's necessary to contextualize the wider discussion about diplomacy, the economy, the role of civil society, etc. The first point I really want to emphasize is the nature of the war in Myanmar. Um, this is very much national uprising. I did my PhD in conflict and civil war, and we don't have this term uprising. It's really unique. And I think it's important to note just how unique this situation is. But it is very much an uprising. It's not a binary civil war with a large neutral population watching both sides. It is a national uprising of the population against the military. As the acting NUG president recently declared, this is the second war for independence, i.e., to finally be rid of a toxic military once and for all. And if how you perceive this conflict, how you define it, shapes the possibilities for resolving it. I think, for instance, some of the calls for mediation and negotiation, they largely miss the point because they frame the conflict as a binary civil war that can be mediated. However, the takeaway from the conflict's nature as a national uprising is that the international community needs to accept that the Myanmar people don't want another so-called transition that is dominated by the military. They want a system freed of having the military hold the country hostage in perpetuity. Second major point is that a critical mass of the Myanmar public feels a strong need to persevere against military dictatorship. At this point, they expect nothing but barbaric violence from the military, but they will persevere despite that. There is also a realization that the only way to be rid of the military is by fighting. That is not the preferred option, but they feel there is no other choice. It's also important to note that the strongest leverage that the SAC, the military regime, has over the Myanmar people is its willingness to use extreme violence. This willingness to use violence is compounded by the inability of the international community to play a role in influencing the junta. That the SAC continues its violent approach means it accepts nothing else. It's because of this zero-sum game is recognized by the vast bulk of the population that they now view armed resistance as this unfortunate necessity that needs to be seen through. Third, it is important to say up front that the Myanmar military can be defeated. Absolutist arguments found in some early analyses that the military cannot be defeated are simplistic and fail to account for how significant the events since the coup have been for Myanmar's modern history. In my opinion, I don't think stalemate is the correct term for describing the situation. That's been used in quite a wide range of analyses. I don't think this is Western Europe in 1917. It's still too early to use that term. The conflict is very nascent, fluid. PDFs are arming up. Conflict spans key states and is now entrenched in Bamar heartland regions, as well as the major cities of Yangon and Mandalay. Overall, nothing is determined about what's going to happen in Myanmar, but it's certainly not a given that the SAC can persevere. I think at this point, what's also very interesting when you look at the conflict is to the extent to which the military has become a foreign occupying force trying to quell uprising. It's really, again, a very, very unique dynamic. I'll also just briefly go into a little bit about what are the strategies for either side in terms of the conflict. For the NUG and the wider Spring Revolution resistance, a core part of their strategy has been trying to ensure that the SAC cannot govern the country. And since the coup, this has involved a range of tactics, including boycotts of state revenues, the CDM movement, and the CDM movement in particular, I think, is really an interesting international precedent or a great example of nonviolent resistance because they've effectively gutted many of the government ministries. In response, the SEC has had to appoint a lot of their own um, cronies and thugs to fill in the gap, especially in terms of local administration. Um, and as the resistance has shifted to armed rebellion, a lot of this has involved targeting these these military proxies or assistants who are functioning as local administrators. Um, and then I'll cover this a bit more, maybe in the second round, Jay, if you can give me time, I'll show the maps. But I think what's important now is that the conflict has progressed to a point where we are seeing shifts in control of territory. Um, and I'll go into the nuances of what that means, but this is important. The conflict really is shifting. Um, and it's important to go into that in a little bit of detail, but to look at what kind of resistance governance or resistance administration is forming. Um, so at one end, we still have the long established systems of EAO governance. These have been ongoing for decades. But then at the other end, we're starting to see new creations. These include things called interim local administration bodies mandated by the NUG. These are known by their Burmese acronym PAP or PAPA. We're also seeing state region level consultative councils form, for instance, in Karenni State or Kachin State or Chin State. And these are very important collectives that bring together different resistance actors um, in those states. And so what we're seeing is a profound reshaping of the country's politics. I think Dalkin Omar made a good point that this is really unprecedented. Um, and I think I can go into that more detail, Jay, if you want me to do it now, or if you would like me to do that later.
Um,
Hello?
oh,
Okay. So
okay.
I'll go into it to just briefly, if you'll give me just a couple more minutes, Jay. I mean, the first point to think about is that, actually, if you can go to the second slide, the next slide. So to the maps, yep, to the maps. Yeah. So these just briefly, these maps are I have a data set. ACLED has 7,600 events. I have 7,200. But basically, when you analyze these conflict incidents, I call them conflict incidents rather than clashes. When you start to analyze these in detail, it starts to form a picture. Um, and basically, the map on the left is a map of what I call contestation. This means where resistance actors are asserting at least some control. And the blue areas are basically areas where EAOs have had a presence for a long time. Now, this doesn't mean they control the entire area. What it means is these are townships or just, areas, and at least parts of those areas are contested by the opposition. If you look, what's interesting though is if you look at on the left side, the map on the left, the orange in the middle, that's northern Magway and Sagaing. And what we're seeing in northern Magway and Sagaing is that there is significant shifting of control to the resistance groups, the PDFs and PDFs collaborating with EAOs. And this is historic because there's never been major conflict in the central areas by the Bamar population. And this is a massive shift in the conflict dynamics. The map on the right shows the extent of the conflict. Basically, what we're seeing is that all the way up the Irrawaddy River Valley, basically the core of the country from Yangon all the way up to northern Sagaing, we now have PDFs firmly entrenched. Again, this is very historic. The PDFs in the southern half of the country aren't as far along as those in the northern half, but they're very active in fighting. What's also important to note is that we see extensive collaboration between these PDFs and EAOs. This again is a very important change in the country's conflict dynamic, because it means the Bamar population is now extensively partnering with EAOs. And this is especially strong in northern Sagaing, together with the KIA, and then across the southeast, together with the KNU. And then in Chin and Kaya State, we've basically seen a consolidation of resistance into a much more unified front between EAOs and the newer self-defense groups to resist SAC, the military regime overall. Can you go to the previous slide, please? Yes, so just briefly, I'll conclude with this point. I mean, I think it's important to see that what we're seeing is that control is a continuum. It goes all the way from no control all the way to full control. A lot of the country is still under the full control of the SAC, certainly in the southwest, Bago, Irrawaddy, Yangon. But what I was trying to illustrate in the previous maps is that large parts of the country are shifting to mixed control. This is in addition to all those areas that were mixed control before the coup. And what we can expect is that over the coming 6 months, I think before the end of the dry season, there will be a solidification of areas of mixed control by the resistance, particularly in Chin, Kaya, northern Magway, Sagaing. This is where the SAC is actively losing control. So I'll leave it at that until the next go around. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Matt Arnold. The way you characterize this as a kind of a, drawing from others, this is a kind of a second war of independence. It's not independence from an outside control, but within the country. This is an independence war by the people against the military. And thank you very much for the maps too. I think it gives a very vivid portrayal of what is happening. There's a distinction between having control and having power. So I think the military has power, to seize power has power, but it has a decreasing control. And we've seen it from the maps. And Dr. Matt, we'll come back to you in the second round in a bit. Let me move on to Gwen Robinson. Gwen has worked on many issues, many areas, but on Myanmar in particular over recent years before the coup, and been to Massaud recently on the border. Gwen, last year, I mean, COVID has adversely impacted all countries' economies. Thailand had a contraction to about 4 or 5%, and Myanmar, the contraction is so deep, 18%. And even this year, we're looking at a very flat growth. So it's a dire situation, the economy. This must have humanitarian implications, and the prospects of the economy are very dim. A lot of major investors have left or are leaving. So what are we looking at here, Gwen, in terms of the Myanmar economy along the border, from your contacts and sources? What are we seeing?
Yeah, I will try and segue neatly between the border and discussion about the economy. But you make a very good point, Jay, and I'd just like to say, I think up to fairly recently, the economy was kind of viewed and often discussed separately and not really intrinsically woven into the narrative about resistance, and a lot of resistance doesn't really focus on things like what's happening with companies and the economy. But as you pointed out, this catastrophic 18% decline in contraction in 1 year in 2021 really said it all about how disastrous the coup is. And I sort of feel that people could actually use this more to take issue, not just about the horrendous human rights record of the junta, but actually their absolutely abysmal economic management, which has actually made things worse, apart from the situation that has come about due to excessive violence, arrests, all that. I think some of the confounding decisions that have crippled the banking industry, and as we have just seen, led to the exit of some of the top Western investors in Myanmar, and notably in 5 days alone, in the last 6 days actually, we've had Total Energies of France, Chevron Corp of the US, and finally yesterday, Woodside Petroleum of Australia, all announced a complete exit from Myanmar, and all citing concerns about deteriorating human rights, and said business was no longer acceptable or thinkable in that country. And that follows, as people might know, the desperate attempts by Norwegian telco Telenor to get out of Myanmar. That's a long and complicated issue, and I'm happy to talk a bit more about that, because it's very interesting what has happened, which is that they have finally, I believe, agreed a deal to go, and they are selling the assets to a combination of the Lebanese investment firm that has been widely, well, let's call it very controversial, and is known to do deals with dodgy regimes, and also bringing in a military, a company that's very close to military connections, and linked also to Mytel, the telco that already has strong military links. So that is what is happening, and I think that's despite what activists say, that the exit, for example, of Chevron and Total Energies was kind of cynical, and them getting out before they were pushed, and also that it was an own goal because their stakes are being divided between their remaining partners, which are Thailand's PTTEP and Myanmar's MOGE, the government-owned oil and gas enterprise. I don't see it as an own goal at all, even though PTTEP and the junta managed to get their hands on the Chevron Total stake for free, and can now share the proceeds just between two. But actually, it's more than that. It's about image. And it was a terrible blow, I think, for the junta to lose all these big companies all in this month. And there are many others. I won't go into that. But just to say that the other new thing I think we can look at is the brand new forecast by the World Bank, which actually I think got it right with their minus 18% prediction for last year, but has just come out with an update of that country forecast, came out on Wednesday, predicting just 1% growth in the year ahead. That actually is possibly, I think, far too positive, but interestingly, the bank really qualified that forecast by saying it is really dependent on the assumption that the impact of continuing conflict will not affect the economy any further than it has. Well, I think given what we're discussing and what Matt has just said, I can't see that the conflict will not have further impact on the economy, and that can also come in the form of further withdrawals of investors, but also all the other range of ways that conflict will impact the economy. And even what Matt's talking about, like the targeted assassinations of local administrators, there are also a wide number of targeted assassinations of corporate executives. We had a very high profile one not too long ago, a Burmese. But I think that is absolutely, it's actually scaring anybody from wanting to work for or be affiliated with the regime on a public administrative level. That's one thing, but I think people are just absolutely petrified, even on the economic front, to join a company that's military linked or sell a product that is produced by the military. I think these are ways, insidious ways that the economic impact it's just begun. And I really can't see Myanmar making 1% growth this year. And interestingly, that World Bank forecast contrasts with the IMF forecast, which is for negative growth, just incremental, minus 0.1%. But it's still more realistic. And even if it's just 0% or 1%, it is absolutely disastrous coming on the heels of a minus 18% contraction. That means that basically if Myanmar can claw back 1% growth this year, it's still minus 17% compared to last year. So I think that really sets the mood, I think, on the economic front. And I'd happily talk about some insights from Mesot in the second round. Perhaps I know that Kun Kasit will have a lot of insights about the regional dynamics. And I think Mesot and the Thai-Myanmar border are at the heart of those regional dynamics. Thailand's being dragged inexorably into Myanmar's crisis, whether it likes it or not. And it all really comes home when you're on that border.
When one implication from what you've just said, the major multinationals, so the Western multinationals, they're bolting. I mean, I think they feel maybe burned a bit by what's happened. Do you think that this will be scarred for a long time? I mean, major Western multinationals will not be coming back anytime, and maybe Myanmar then will be left to the more Asian, Chinese, Thai multinationals. That's one thing. The other thing that you may note of, the economic contraction basically minus 18%, and 1%. So basically, the economy has been reduced in size by almost 1/5 over the past year, and if you compound it by COVID. So moving forward, GDP, I think the size of the Myanmar economy will shrink by up to a quarter. Now, up to a quarter, meaning that there'll be lost jobs. I mean, this is a huge setback on the Myanmar economy, especially after the decade of investment and trade and so on. What do you say about the Western multinationals and more Asian multinationals who can kind of live with the junta?
Well, that's really interesting. I doubt, particularly given that there's likely to be more sanctions coming, I really doubt that there will be many Western companies that are prepared to live with the junta or invest under this current climate. But you have a very good point. The prospect for any coming back, I think the trouble is, and the tragedy, I think, of the departure of these Western companies is that even if miraculously, the PDS stormed Naypyidaw, threw the junta out of power, took over, came up with an acceptable People's United Government or whatever it was, tomorrow, you can't bring, this is like turning around a battleship. And I think the withdrawals of these huge companies, and that means big infrastructure, huge investments, it's not going to, it couldn't come back even if they wanted very quickly. And I really doubt, even if there was miraculously some resolution, I think it would be a very long time before any big Western investor would want to venture back in. They'd really have to have proof. They'd have to see that for at least 2 years stability, I think. But that's a real issue. But you raised another very good point, which is about whether, yes, you're right. It does, and activists have pointed this out too. Amazingly, when Total and Chevron announced their withdrawal, I saw some very negative Twitter traffic, sort of, complaining that these companies have exploited, put up with human rights abuses, and now taking the money and cutting and running. So some of the big companies quite rightly said, "What do you want us to do?" But I think, of course, it opens the way. It's not like all that investment's gone. The Russians are all over Yangon, Rosneft through Bashneft, and I think the Chinese are already very invested in Myanmar, are likely to increase, and you'll see other actors. We've had reports of Iranian missions and Serbians coming to sell arms, so it will become more like that, I think, and standards will slip, and that will reinforce this aversion that Westerners will have. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Gwen. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you second round, maybe talk a little bit about your visit to Massaud and some of the realities on the ground there. Ambassador Kasit Pirom Krap, you know, ASEAN has been at a loss, I think, about how very hard pressed in dealing with this Myanmar coup crisis. And ASEAN was already kind of divided over the South China Sea, China, US, geopolitical rivalry and competition. So this Myanmar coup crisis has further deepened that division. And I think clearly we have, from the outset, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and up to a point Philippines on the one side calling for the return to democratic process, and the other side is kind of silent, not saying much, including Thailand. How do you see now that ASEAN is under Cambodian chairmanship? Prime Minister Hun Sen recently visited General Min Aung Hlaing. Is ASEAN on a back foot? Can we hope for what can ASEAN do to make a constructive, positive difference in the Myanmar civil war now?
Thank you. Let me recall a bit that the setting up of ASEAN was not based on ideological commitment. So we have 10 member states with different political regime, from absolute monarchy to quite a liberal democratic country like in Indonesia. And in the past, I think the original members of ASEAN plus Brunei were able to stand together to ward off the expansion of communism. So there was a common ideology and sense of purpose. And when globalization came along, every member of ASEAN, old and new, was able to adapt to the open market economy, participating in a sort of the capitalism type of economic activities. But now when it comes to the challenges forthcoming from democracy and human rights, ASEAN as a whole and collectively is not in the position to handle this issue. So that has reflected in this trying to handle the Myanmar crisis. It cannot, because spiritually, ideologically, and so on, the member state of ASEAN, most of them are not in the position to tackle the question of democracy and human rights, because they are not democratic and they do not go for the universal values in any way. So that is the inherent structural difficulty inside ASEAN. We have to realize that. But just to inform you that just a few days ago, APHR, where I am also a member of the executive board, we did have a Zoom discussion with some representative of the permanent mission of ASEAN to the ASEAN Secretariat, with of the ambassadors and so on. And then we came to the view that Indonesia, as the most democratic, biggest ASEAN founding member of ASEAN, and part of this, I think, progressive member states of ASEAN, with together with Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines, should work together to push ASEAN forward and to bring Somdet Hun Sen, the current chair of ASEAN, to toe the line and play the collective role, the team game, and not to go unilateral or play individualistic role. So that is I think, a sort of the APHR proposals to some of the permanent representative of ASEAN to the ASEAN Secretariat. Second, what we have proposed also that for the ASEAN to recognize the NUG. I think this is very important, because you cannot have dialogue unless and until, I think, ASEAN, through its chair or individual member state, not only to speak to the military junta, but to start talking to the NUG to provide a sort of this balancing act and sense of fair play, and to boost the NUG, which is more or less a legitimate representative of the Myanmar people. At the same time, I think let me mention also AP Chow also had a meeting with the Norwegian as the current chair of the UN permanent member of the UNSC. We also had informal discussion with Her Excellency Madame Noreen Hessel, the new UN Special Envoy for Myanmar. And with the Norwegian as well as with UN Special Envoy, we did emphasize the need for the UN to come in on the humanitarian assistance to provide I think, to be the overall coordinator and as well as to I think, press the military junta to open humanitarian corridor, and without having all the humanitarian assistance having to go through the Myanmar junta, and at the same time for the UN to press the Thai government to provide cross-border facilitation for humanitarian assistance. Okay, let me mention that. But coming back to ASEAN again, I think the Myanmar crisis has shown that ASEAN cannot go on operating without a common ideology. And in that sense, there is a need for a drastic reform of ASEAN to become more democratic. It cannot go on being quite quasi-democratic, or most of the time authoritarian. It will not be in the position to handle anything, neither to have a common collective stand when it comes to many of the global issues like terrorism or I think things that have been going on in terms of, I think, ethnic conflicts and I think the rise of authoritarianism and so on. And I think almost a year ago, myself and a group of ASEAN politicians did come out with a proposal about an alternative ASEAN or a new ASEAN that would be based on, I think, universal values or democracy and human rights. This is something that we have to start thinking now. And at the same time, I think we have learned that a few weeks ago, the Indonesian foreign ministry did come out with a paper that is talking about the future setup of ASEAN. So there is, I think, something going on already about, I think, reform of ASEAN to make it more in tune with the current happening. With I think, and to link that to the people-centered and ASEAN centrality. Both of these principles cannot be pushed forward unless and until inside of each ASEAN member state and inside of ASEAN as a whole is based on democratic principles. So this is something that I just want to mention here, I think, in the first round. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Kasit. You mentioned the recognition of NUG. In fact, the 5-point consensus call for dialogue with all parties in the conflict, not just the military. So I think there has to be some engagement with the opposition groups as well, even within the basis of the 5-point consensus. You also mentioned the UN's role about the humanitarian corridors. We have some questions now from audience, viewers, and listeners. And one question, Ambassador, is about the recent US-Thai discussions about setting up this humanitarian corridors. Have you come across any progress along these lines, the corridors along the border, Thailand-Myanmar border?
I myself have not heard directly, but let me mention also that Kin Oman and myself, we have been on the panels together with the representative of the NUG and members of the NUGs, the cabinet members, as well as, I think, quite a few Myanmar NUGs. And then we have also been on the panel discussion with many of the international NGOs and local Thai NGOs and so on. But in short, collectively, I think we have sent 2 open letters to the Thai Prime Minister for him to decide on opening of the Thai-Myanmar border for humanitarian assistance, and for Thailand to work very closely with the UN agencies to facilitate the welcoming of the refugees, as well as to, I think, facilitate cross-border humanitarian assistance. So this is what we have been doing, I think, in the context of the NGO, to press the Thai government to act what it has been doing for so many decades, that is to be a place of refuge for the people coming from the neighboring countries under suppression and repression by their respective governments and so on. So this is what we have been doing. And we have learned also that on the NUG side, they have set up coordinating task force and so on to welcome humanitarian assistance. But everything has been blocked by the Thai government. Everything that has been done so far about cross-border assistance was to be done in a very informal, and it is more or less up to the discretion of the border police with some, I think, Minister of Interior officials or with some petty minor military officer of the Thai government. Nothing is being done in a sort of a systematic and organized manner. And so far, the Thai government still more or less practice the pushback principle. So this is something that we have been trying to push the Thai government, and we have started to work more closely with the members of the Thai House of Representatives, and especially with the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand. They have sent, I think, fact-finding mission to the border a few weeks ago, and I think we are pressing them to spearhead the push on the Thai government to open the Thai-Myanmar border for humanitarian assistance. We also have suggested to the Thai government to declare a no-fly zone, that is to tell the military junta of Myanmar not to send aircrafts along the Thai-Myanmar borders and doing the bombing and the killings and so on of Thai villagers as well as the fleeing displaced persons of Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You mentioned, before I move on to Kinoma and Dr. Matt Arnold, about ASEAN along the lines of democracy. I think the benchmark that I was thinking about is democracy would be a challenge benchmark for ASEAN unity, centrality, but perhaps maybe legitimacy. I mean, this is an issue. Myanmar military does not have legitimacy. You can claim that other ruling regimes around the region perhaps have a degree of legitimacy. So maybe that could be a benchmark. I'll come back to you, Ambassador, about the ASEAN summits and ASEAN-related summits. If the status quo prevails, what's likely to happen there? And but now I want to turn attention to Kinoma and Dr. Matt Arnold. I also want to invite questions, remarks, comments, feedback from audience members, viewers and listeners. The floor is open now. We have one question about the EAOs. There's an ICG recent report describing how the ethnic armed organizations are not so united, are divided and cautious when it comes to supporting the NUG and the National Unity Government and People's Defense Force. Omar, you mentioned about the unity, Myanmar people's unity and solidarity. Let's focus on this a little bit. How united is it? I mean, certainly there's a common cause here of being anti-military, trying to reverse the coup. But beyond that, you mentioned also the Federal Democratic Union. Is that a common goal shared by all opposition movements? The CDM, PDF, EAOs, and so on. If you look at Cambodia and Thailand, opposition has been divided. The opposition has been trying to take the ruling regime to task, calling for reforms and so on. There's been a conscious divide and rule effort by the incumbent established centers of power in Cambodia. Very clear, Prime Minister Hun Sen, the Cambodian People's Party, and the opposition late in recent weeks have kind of split between Kem Sokha and Sam Rainsy. So there's no opposition unity and solidarity there, and therefore it benefits the ruling regime in Thailand as well. I mean, no time to go into detail, but the opposition, they have one cause, one common view of reform and change, but then they don't really have an alternative reality for what should take place, to come into its place. In Myanmar, if all this can be reversed, we go back to the decade of reform, Omar, or what does it look like? A Federal Democratic Union, how you really united the opposition coalition. Omar.
Thank you, Ajahn. Here I see two levels. I'm not so sure how Matthew will see it, but from my point of view, I see the people's solidarity is one level, whereas also there is the political side or the politicians. There's another camp. But at this moment, what I see is the forces of people or the solidarity among the people from across board has come to be much greater than the political forces or the mainstream political parties politicians. You can, like those who follow Myanmar know very well, for example, like even in the past 10 years and even in the past 5 years time, there was so much hope and expectation on the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi's leadership when it comes to the ethnic struggle and the dream for the federal union, where in the reality in the past 5 years there were many hurdles, or those expectations that Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD actually fell short of those expectations from the ethnic communities or the non-Burma, the minority ethnic communities. And because of that reality, that this sort of in our country, there's been never been a chance to build the we never had a chance to have this nation building process, ever since the British from the independence from British. What I see is that the in the past 10 years was a moment, sort of kind of everybody's testing out, from all different political actors, but that there were a lot of shortfalls. That's why you see like a very expensive 10 years peace process, in fact, failed. And in spite of this huge amount of money that peace donors from Western countries spent, but I think there were also some good things happen, because there were a lot of intra-ethnic exchanges and communications and networking happen, especially among the people, I would say. So that actually led to this larger, greater people solidarity that we're seeing now, which go beyond this politicians' difference of opinion that they were having, or like a different resentment towards National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi, which is Aung San Suu Kyi and National League for Democracy were sort of more or less they were on the side of this Burmanization or Burma nation building, Buddhist Burma nation building project that the military has been building all along, designing and building all along. And so National League for Democracy was not really on the side of the genuine national reconciliation with the ethnic communities, that there were some of this Burma project agenda were even forced into the ethnic communities. So that's the one thing that we see now among the politicians level. There is still a lot more need to be done in terms of the trust building, you see. But like I said, because people's trust has now gone beyond the politicians, that's why we are seeing this great unity among the people. But what I want to say here is that, based on my experience working with the different ethnic communities, whether they're ethnic armed organizations or the youth or the women, what I learned is that the trust can only come based on the reconciliation can only come based on the trust, and the trust will come only based on the actual action in practice with the genuine political will. And I think this is something that we still need to work on. But saying that, there are some good political processes are taking place. We have this political or like a policy coalition called the National Consultative National and UCC, National Unity Consultative Council. That's when everybody is trying to come together. I'm using the word trying because I still see, my observation is that process still need to go far. But regardless of that, it is so firm that people may have a different understanding intellectually of what federal democratic unions or federal democratic governance really means on the ground. But in terms of the vision, how this country should set out to be, everybody is very on the same page, which is the federal democratic union or the federal democracy. I think that is where I see that, is so concrete that we need to build on. We need to build on. But like I said, among the politicians, there is still a lot more to do. That's my take.
Just very quick follow-up, Omar. I cannot not be able to get a military representative to speak with us for another view. But what would be going in the minds of the high command of the Tatmadaw? They think they can just maybe ride out the storm, use more violence. They have the arms, they have the big guns. I'm just trying to think how they must be seeing it. And you mentioned that there could be cracks, so maybe there's some pressure inside. If you have anything to say about that, we don't have a military view here. But more directly, Umar, about Aung San Suu Kyi you mentioned. And, she's been now slapped with all kinds of charges and jail sentences and so on. Her political future is very much in doubt now. But beyond her, do you see new leadership coming up among the opposition coalition, Omar? Don't have to name names, but do you see kind of a core leadership that can come up to lead this whole process, Omar?
I think Burma has passed beyond one person, one figure leadership. That's what I want to stress here. I think the Spring Revolution has already given birth to this coordinated collective leadership in the more or less, like a young generation looking out to have more this collective leadership where they are not, like even some people are saying like, oh, what if Aung San Suu Kyi is released? I know if the military release her, will the people will go back to, stay quiet and back down from the revolution? And what I learned, when I listen to the people on the ground, that's not going to be the case anymore. People are so firm with where they are and what they want to achieve and how they're going to achieve together. But in terms of course, in the actual governing, there will always be this political leadership, which I think now with this political alliance that I just mentioned, I think this is where people are looking into kind of like building it and then look like working together to establish the federal constitution, setting out like a kind of like a discuss the roadmap, the political roadmap of the country and the policies to move forward. So I'm hoping, I'm for one, I'm for one looking into no more like a one person figure political leadership, but it's more of this more genuine democratic collective leadership from the young generation. That's where my hope is lying. But just one point very quickly, ethnic armed organizations. Some of them, as you see, many of them are on the same page with the Spring Revolution, People's Movement. They are in fact, joining these young People's Defense Force, young PDFs, and training them and supporting them. But there are a few not necessarily taking a firm stand yet. But then if you really ask them, they're not really far either. I think I also know as a fact that this Federal Democratic Union vision is quite a common collective vision, even for those EAOs that may not be taking as many steps as the other EAOs are taking, joining the People's Revolution at this point. But only, I think, like I said, one reason is there's been a huge deficit of lack of trust in the past towards the Burma majority politicians. So I think there can be still a lot of these reservations, such as like NUG or the NUCC or the NLD, the largest political party itself, how that mainstream Burma politicians can really pledge and keep up their promise towards the federal union is might be still a question and some reservation among some of those ethnic armed organizations, which I think is very natural.
Okay, so the EAOs, even though they may not be fully united or fully on board with the NUG PDF, but none of the EAOs has been against NUG PDF. I think that would be what you're saying.
Yes.
Let me turn to Dr. Matt Arnold, also about the EAOs and about the situation on the ground. Would you say this? I mean, are the battlefield outcomes shaping and determining Myanmar's political future now? So, basically, what happens on the battlefields now, in the guerrilla battlefields, very small scale and very spread out. This has become the main decider, isn't it, Dr. Matt Arnold, as to what will happen moving forward? And if you can talk a little bit about the battlefield itself, one way, the airstrikes, I think the more airstrikes we see, the more signs we will see of the Myanmar military's desperation or being on the back foot. And to deal with the airstrikes, I mean, one is the no-fly zone. I think that was mentioned already. But another one would be the kind of the anti-aircraft weaponry that the PDF could get their hands on. There's also a question about the the kind of hardware that the PDF gets. Where is it from, and what kind of training? How well trained, how well equipped and armed is a PDF? Can it be a potent force sufficient to face off against the Tatmadaw, Dr. Matt Arnold?
Okay, yeah. So I think just to add briefly on the previous point, I mean, I think personally I've always had hesitation about the term EAOs. I mean, it serves a purpose, but it also leads to kind of overgeneralizations. Like there's this notion immediately after the coup that the EAOs had to be supportive, otherwise nothing was possible. I think the reality is, is there a critical mass of different resistance actors that can work together against the military? And I think we have that critical mass. There's a very strong commitment to the Spring Revolution from the KIA, KNU, KNPP, the CNF. These are, especially the KNU and KIA, but also the KNPP. These are major groups. A lot of these EAOs, especially a majority of them that had signed the NCA, weren't particularly significant on the ground. They didn't have lots of actual military capability. So I think when we talk about the EAOs, we have to talk about there's a political significance, but there's also a military significance. And at this point, there's really not a lot of value to just talking about the EAOs in general. I think we have to be specific about who we're talking about. And the partnership of the KNPP with the Ukrainian PDFs, for instance, or the partnership with the CNF with the Chin self-defense groups, these are massive. Same with the KNU and the KIA. So I think overall, what we've seen is this critical mass of resistance come together. I mean, everybody would love if the AA would join. That would be massive. But I think the main point is that at the start of 2022, the military is in a very bad position militarily. They are taking hits all over the place. I think I get why the media likes to talk about defections. It's important politically, socially. In terms of the actual military situation on the ground, I personally don't think that the defections are that definitive. What's more important are two other dynamics. One, the military is suffering large casualties. Even if you just accept 10% of the figures put out, this is still major. This is massive. And then the other massive trend that we see is that the military cannot recruit. You know, their main recruitment areas were Magway and Sagaing. These are now the hotbeds of resistance. So I think the reality is that the military situation is now driving the wider politics and economics and social issues. And the military is doing very, very, very poorly. And I think they don't have any, there's no clear, epiphany that they can have. There's no brilliant strategy that they can develop that is able to reverse a situation where fundamentally the entire country is revolting against them. And when they have to fight across the entire length and breadth of the country, this is not sustainable. And I think there's a fighting season in Myanmar. It goes up to the end of the dry season, and that means we still have another 3-4 months to it. But the military is in an exceptionally bad position, and especially so because of what's happening in the west and the north. Um, I mean, the Sagaing is a massive, massive area, and they can't leave. They're basically they can garrison some towns, and their strategy is basically to inflict, horrible violence on the population, and they hope that the population will then uh, put pressure on the resistance to stop attacks. I don't think that's going to happen at this point because we've already crossed this threshold where the population says, no matter what, we have to get rid of this military once and for all because they're barbaric. So I think yes, there's no. At the beginning, we could call this a political crisis. At this point, it's very much it's a war. It's an armed conflict. Airstrikes are important. Certainly, they can be very difficult for resistance forces to counter. I mean, I spent a year with the U.S. military in Afghanistan. We had endless amounts of air support. Even if you have all of that, it doesn't mean you can conclusively defeat rebels. And I think the Myanmar military, they don't have a massive air force. They're not particularly good at close air support, but they do have air assets and they can inflict damage, especially when it comes to bombing villages and shooting up villages. So I mean, as part of their wider strategy of just targeting civilians, they'll use it. I think what the international community has to be aware of is that this is their strategy. It's just violence against civilians. Um, so I think in terms of hardware for the PDFs, I mean this is. I mean we have to give these people credit. I mean they've started with next to nothing, with nothing, and they're fighting back against an incredibly brutal, violent military regime using very little. Um, I mean, to the point where they're using muskets. Um, they've definitely there's been a lot of advancement in terms of IEDs, the bombing attacks against military vehicles. But overall, this is very much a situation where the military has much more significant weaponry than the resistance. I think though, when you analyze things from a military perspective, we have to look at trajectories. And what are the trajectories here now? From the military side, from the military perspective, their challenges, despite everything they're doing, the resistance is not decreasing. They've been using horrible violence against civilians since the beginning. They're doing it now. They can during the dry season. That's going to be harder during the rainy season with the airstrikes. But it's not decreasing the resistance. The resistance is only increasing. And then, like I said, they're suffering casualties and they're not able to recuperate. So I think overall they're in a very, very bad position. And that sometimes we miss that because we just see all these social media snapshots and it doesn't give an accurate picture. Um, the other thing I just want to emphasize in terms of the political situation and the future of federalism, I think there is a lot of solidarity. Um, there there are challenges. It's a complex country. It's always going to be there's always going to be points of contention. That's just to be expected. It's normal. I think the thing that I want to to highlight, though, are how national politics and local politics are being reorganized, and that there's basically been a diffusion of political power across the country, where it's not just Aung San Suu Kyi versus the generals. What we've seen is a lot of local political empowerment. A lot of these these local administration bodies are based on local leaders, civil society leaders, community activists, just youth. And then NLD, even within the NLD, there's been a huge amount of diffusion of political power because of the necessity of the resistance. The other thing that I think is really needs a lot more emphasis in this discussion is the creation of these state councils, these state consultative councils. For instance, the Karenni State Consultative Council, the Kachin Political Interim Coordination Team, the Interim Chin National Consultative Council. These are real institutions that are fundamental to what happens. Particularly, I think that the Karenni State Consultative Council, the KSCC. This is an organization that is at the forefront of providing humanitarian assistance. It's at the forefront of consolidating and organizing the armed resistance in Kaya State, and it's incredibly important for the wider political discussions. So I think overall, we need to look at the country with a new framework, with a new lens. It doesn't make sense that the 2021 was so massive. Even things like terms EAOs, it's too general, and it's archaic at this point. It doesn't fit it's not fit for purpose anymore. We have to be more specific. So I think overall, just to your first question, Jay, to Ken Omar, was that we are seeing a reorganization of national politics, and it doesn't mean everything's going to be smooth sailing. But this is a moment of historic change, and I think fundamentally that the trajectory is positive.
Okay, Matt.
Can I, Ajahn,
uh,
can I just raise just very one point add to Dr. Arnold said? These new political structures, local structures, like the Karenni State Consultative Council, for example, they have the Karenni State Police. And if you really look at all of these local structures, governance structures, are trusted by the local people. And I think that is so important to add. So thank you, Dr. Arnold, for your points as well.
Well, and
yes,
also
so there's
to
a kind
add
of
that they're not competing with the NUG. This is part of a wider effort.
yeah.
So we're not
So there's a kind of a
organization of Myanmar. We're seeing a wide resistance emerge with a shared aspiration. Number one, to be rid of a toxic military, but two, to create a new political settlement based around federalism and democracy.
Yeah. So there's a kind of organic alternative shadow government from the ground up being formed, emerging. Dr. Arnold, just a very 1 minute. The aerial supremacy can prolong this war for a long time, indefinitely, for the military, and we can assume that they will get bigger guns, even better weaponry from the people that will sell it to them. So this could be prolonged that way. Do you see any movement within the high command, within the SAC, the Tatmadaw, the senior most generals? Are there some moderates or alternatives to So Win and Senior General Min Aung Hlaing? As the pressure builds, I would think that within the high command there must be a lot of concerns as well. Dr. Matt, do you see anything like that?
At this point, no. I think the senior Tatmadaw leadership is very cohesive, consolidated. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but I'm not sure it's definitive. I think what's more significant is that the military is spread so thin all over the country, and it's unsustainable. It's just maxed out.
Okay, thank you very much. Gwen Robinson. Gwen, you went to Method recently. What were some of the questions there along the border? In view of the humanitarian crisis, the IDPs, internally displaced persons, and just the people coming back and forth and having to cross because of being bombed and so on.
Well, maybe just to put people in the picture who mightn't be so familiar, because I wasn't until I went up to see how volatile the whole situation is. One day, there's only, official figures are there's only about 300 to 400 people left right now. But like some weeks ago, there were, Thailand got hit with nearly 10,000 some weeks ago, and this is just around Mae Sot. I think there's more up in around Mae Hong Son. So I think every day this changes. And I did hear Kun Kasit's very good points about how Thailand officially has not been helpful, I think he even used the word blocking proposals, for example, humanitarian corridors and no-fly zones. Actually, what really struck me was on the ground, how many things are happening informally. There are a lot of people just informally coming and going. There are rules about where refugees are being kept. Well, you're not supposed to call them refugees, they're displaced persons. And there's supposed to be rules. Actually, unofficially, I think a lot of the Thai forces have been, if not overly humane, they've been quite decent in letting through some supplies, particularly from local Burmese, I say NGOs, but they're not really registered. There's a lot of this sort of tacit support going on, and I don't think the Thais are being entirely heartless. The other thing is, I know, the areas are seething with resistance, as well as obviously displaced persons, and I think Thailand has been very tolerant of that, possibly under a lot of pressure from the UN and the US not to send back people. Refugees are not being done over and screened about whether they are PDFs, CDMs, whether they're from Yangon or some village in Kaya. So I think there is I have to commend the Thais. This situation blew up. It's been a real problem for them. I don't think they've handled it superbly well, but given the number of other issues the Thai government's dealing with, and I don't want to be an apologist for the Thai government, but I do think I do think they're not, they do perhaps deserve a little more credit and less straight out. I think the international community also needs Thailand to be responsive and tolerant, because it's possibly, given the way the military is going, I think this situation could only get worse. So now we've got about 400, I think, displaced people that were being kept in a cow shed. That number rose to more than 2,000. A lot of those have gone. It's very hard to work out whether a lot of them have just gone back across. But when you do stand on the border at some of the crossing points, you realize you can wade across in 5 minutes, and it's that narrow in some parts. And actually I think there's a lot of Thai support along the border that is very sympathetic, and in fact maybe ethnically Karen or Karenni or speaks the language. A lot of Thai groups cooking food and trying to get it into the displaced people. So I was impressed. But what really struck me, given what we've just talked about, with a lot of seething things going on in the background about proposals on humanitarian corridors, or maybe even more proactive assistance being suggested, I think, by a range of Western organisations and possibly governments, is I was on the Cambodian border in the 1980s, and I know that really dates me, but I'm sure Kun Kasit was all over that one. And when you were sitting in Aranya Pratet on the Cambodian border in the 80s, and you saw the phenomenal operation that accommodated all the Khmer refugees fleeing the Khmer Rouge, there are shades of, I'm not suggesting that it will develop like that, but I think there is a real possibility that there could be, when you look at the intrigues and the political diplomacy and the proposals flying around, and now how much international organisations and governments are involved in this rather neglected part of the border, where only the main international organisation, as far as I could see, was the Thai Border Consortium, which is, you know, a fantastic alliance of NGOs. But really, when you see how much more focus there is there, you do think, this operation could really evolve.
Yeah, I think one distinction, Gwen, maybe it's not that Thailand could have done worse, but I think some people might be asking, why isn't Thailand doing more and better? It's not that Thailand could have done worse, but why isn't it not doing better? I think, Ambassador Kasit, you have been the foreign minister. Would you think that if there was a more civilian-backed government in Thailand, the country, Thailand, would be doing more, would be more at the forefront, along with Indonesia, Malaysia, perhaps? So maybe you can tell us a little bit about why is Thailand reacting, behaving, doing what it's doing vis-a-vis the Myanmar coup crisis? And then moving forward, Ambassador Kasit, this year, the ASEAN summits and related summits, big year for Cambodia chairmanship, because I think this is Prime Minister Hun Sen's last time to chair ASEAN. It's one song in a way, and he wants to make the most out of it. But if this situation prevails and continues, are we to expect major dialogue partners, major countries not to attend some of these summits? Ambassador Kasit.
I think the first point, I think why Thailand under General Prayut government has not been acting as it should or expected. I think the first point is, I think the personal relationship between General Prayut and Senior General Maung Eng Lai. I think it's a family close relationship. Second, when General Prayut staged the coup d'etat in 2014, the first foreign visitor was Senior General Maung Eng Lai. And third, I think the sort of the cordial relationship between the two armed forces, military to military. So these are the three things that I think help to explain why Thailand has not done anything in a more positive and constructive manner. And fourth, I think, is the very weakness of in the very personality of the current Thai Foreign Minister, Kundon. I think he has not been, I think I have known him for decades. He's not the type of a proactive person, very mild-mannered, polite and so on, but not a person of action or a person doing things based on some sort of a certain belief and so on. So all of this. And the other point is that the UN, as well as I think the United States and the Western world, including Japan and so on, have not been forthcoming to the Thai government in terms of pushing the Thai government. I don't know why, because when I was Director General of the International Organization Department, or when I was Foreign Minister, on both occasions, my normal visitors were UNHCR, and then the Swedish ambassador, British, and so on. So I was on that radar screen practically every week. They keep on pushing me, for Thailand to carry out all the humanitarian undertakings on I think for the Vietnamese boat people, Cambodian, Laotian, monks, and so on, and on the Thai-Myanmar border. I am surprised at the moment that I think the diplomatic corps at the UN agency have not been acting like what they used to do, because I felt that at that time, for so many years and so on, as a career diplomat and in the political arena, I was constantly under their watchful eyes and pressure that Thailand has to act accordingly to the spirit of letters of the UN various conventions and so on, and the humanitarian record of Thailand. So that I think all of this has come to the point that for the past 11, 12 months, the Thai government under General Prayut Chan-o-cha has not acted in a more forceful manner. General Prayut also professed to come to be an elected prime minister, but I think somehow he has no heart and soul for the plight of the Myanmar people or for democracy in that sense. So I think it's a mental, intellectual, spiritual problem at this point in time. But I think, nevertheless, I think we have to keep on trying, pushing General Prayut, the Thai government, to have an open heart and open mind policy and to act accordingly. And once Thailand opened the border, then all the things, on the humanitarian side would be much solved and so on. Then on the second point, for the summit and so on, I think, as I have mentioned earlier, Indonesia and the other 3 progressive members of ASEAN, namely Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, the 4 of them must tell and reprimand Hun Sen not to do anything unilateral and not to allow Hun Sen to keep on saying that the decision to come to ASEAN meetings is up to the junta and not up to the other 9 ASEAN members. That cannot be allowed. Hun Sen has to act on the collective decision and will of his other ASEAN fellow member states and so on. This is what has the Indonesia has to take a lead in that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Your comment about Thailand carries a lot of authority because you were in government, you were a foreign minister, more than any of us could say. And the ASEAN-related summits, I just want to just one more minute on this. Do you think there's a risk that, if this situation continues, that there will be a boycott of the ASEAN-related summits?
Well, I think the Myanmar, what you call progressive voice of Myanmar under Kim Oman, and then together with diasporas and so on, including APHR and so on, I think we have been, reaching out to the Biden administration for President Biden either to postpone the U.S. ASEAN summit meeting, or even and particularly not to invite Hun Sen to attend, as long as I think the situation he has been, I think, more on the side of the military junta. I think we have been working on this point, and that would, I think, applicable to the other ASEAN dialogues, with other dialogue partners and so on, that I think Myanmar would be out. And then second, if Hun Sen were to be, I think, not only suppressing his own people, denying democracy, and at the same time being, I think, colluding with the military junta, then he should not be representing ASEAN as a whole. It would be a dishonor to ASEAN as a whole. And also it would not be nice for the counterpart, whether the US or the EU or even Japan and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. We're coming to time. In the last 10 minutes or so, I want to just have the last round going around. So at this point, we can say that what's going on in Myanmar 1 year after the military takeover is that there's an internal war for the country's future. And this is no less than that. And that war within the country, between the people and all the opposition groups and ethnic armies and so on, against the Tatmadaw military, SAC. The war is not static, very dynamic and fluid, and it appears that the tide is shifting not in favor of the military with bigger guns, but towards the side of the opposition coalitions with fewer guns, but with a nationwide consensus, commitment, and resolve. Now I would like to ask Kinoma and Dr. Arnold to look forward a little bit. We can't really just put a time frame on this. It's already 1 year, but how long are we looking at before the tide really turns, and what would the end game look like? Hard to imagine that the opposition coalitions can take over Naypyidaw. It becomes an armed contest, and the military has the big guns still, and also with the airstrikes currently. So moving forward, are we looking at another year of this attrition warfare shifting slightly towards in favor of the opposition coalitions? And then, if not, if the tide really turns, then how does it shape? At the end of it, what happens? Maybe there will be an internal coup within the Tatmadaw, the high command, the senior generals will go at it, and someone else will emerge. Have you identified? Is there anyone that could be interested in dialogue as the pressure mounts on the military? Kinoma, Matt Arnold, and Kinoma, if the military loses its way, really, is the opposition coalition prepared to take over? What kind of a game plan they have there? Kinoma.
Thank you, Ajahn. When the military falls, I have no doubt the Myanmar people, the current political leadership of the movement, and also the civil society and the academics, the including the like a civil servants and all of these people who have joined the movement, they are already running the parallel um, administrations or service provisions, or like keeping up with the social fabric of the society in many ways already. So I have no doubt that we will be able to, like the people will be able to run the country. Of course, there will be a lot of assistance will be needed by that time. But before getting to that point, just to come back to your other question, is how much time for the tide to turn. I won't be able to say of my opinion, I shouldn't, but I listen to the people. And what I'm hearing from the ground is people are saying, let's have our victory in 2022. So they are aiming of that this year as their time of the victory for the revolution. But of course, there are so many other factors, and like including how the international actors roles and involvement, especially the business communities. And now, like what one said is, we have this Serbia, uh, uh, India, Iran, Russia. These international actors are also trying to back this murderous military junta. So it's not only the people of Myanmar are facing not only the military junta in Naypyidaw, but also the other powerful actors who are supporting behind or supporting this military or bankrolling this military to be able to carry on with their atrocity crimes on the ground. So I think that's why it's so important. Those of us also, from the diaspora, also the our democracy allies, like a civil society across the world, who are now joining the Myanmar People's Revolution from other means and other ways, like for example, campaigning, putting pressure on these companies, or putting pressure on or the advocating to the governments like US and EU and UK, Canada, Australia, like Japan, Korea, to really impose the targeted sanctions against their military, their businesses, their cronies businesses, their families businesses, also like to stop these arms dealers going to supporting to the military. So we have so many other strategies and tactics to really corner this military. And I think that's what we will be doing more inside, when the people on the ground keep resisting this military with all these creative ways and general strikes, and the strikes, who are doing the demonstrations carrying on, like in the next few days you will be seeing these demonstrations, or to mark the February 1 attempted coup anniversary. People will be coming up with a lot of creative ideas already coming up. So I think what we are seeing is this sort of like, for this military junta, sort of like squeeze in between the people, the forces, the resistance forces within the country, whereas also the democratic forces in support of the Myanmar People's Revolution from outside, doing all of these pressure campaigns to cut the financial flows to the military, also opening the universal jurisdiction case, or try to get the International Criminal Court to act, or to exercise the jurisdiction that the National Unity Government already requested. So there are many other efforts are happening. It's all kind of building up, and I think that is what we will continue to be doing. So if that all works well, what we also need is, like Ajahn Kunkasit said, we need the actors like Hun Sen to back out. I think that's so important. You know, even in next few hours, he's going to be Friday in New York in the morning. He's briefing to the UN Security Council. You see, we need these actors who knowingly that they cannot do much on the ground to help the people, but even do more harm to the people. They need to back out, and we need all the support we can to stop these actors like Hun Sen to back out. I think that's where we are at the moment. But to conclude is, I think in terms of the time, for me, I have passed more than 30 years of my life as a democracy student activist from 1988. I know so much of the strength, solid on the ground, opportunities, as well as also immense challenges the Myanmar people are facing in this spring revolution. So I'm for one, not to be anticipating of the timeline in next 1 year or 2 year, but I think with this kind of like a collective coordinated effort from all sides together in this year or next year time, I think this is where people are expecting, and we should be able to support the people to realize their dream in this period of time, because also the loss of people's life on the ground should not further anymore. So with that, I will end here. Ajahn, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kinoma. Thank you very much. I think also it should be noted that the people who are doing all the resisting and fighting back, they're also doing it at a great cost to themselves. They also suffer from fighting back, but they're willing to bear that cost. And it's been sustained for the year. So they've demonstrated that they can be in it for the long haul. Dr. Matt Arnold, maybe a little bit, just a last remark from you about the battlefield directions. This is an internal war of independence, a civil war kind of. The time frame ahead at this rate, are we looking at a long time, or the tide will shift soon, near future? Dr. Matt Arnold?
Overall, I think if we assume that this is an uprising, I don't think we should expect any kind of conventional conclusion to this war. I don't think Naypyidaw is going to be surrounded and taken by conventional forces. This is a national uprising. For me personally, I think the military can and will be defeated. I think if you look at how much pressure they've come under within just the first year, it's really incredible. Especially considering the lack of resources that the resistance actually has. Personally, what I think will happen is that over the course of the next 2-3 months, the military is going to lose more territory. It'll be able to maintain garrisons, but it'll suffer high casualties. I think the key EAOs will maintain their participation, the KNU, the KIA, KNPP, and the CNF. And so what I expect is that if the military does continue to suffer high casualties and does effectively lose control of territory across the West and the North, that ultimately what we'll see is that the military will collapse. And I don't think it'll be a conventional grand battle at the end where they take over the Naypyidaw. And I think what we can see is, even if you look at the Afghan National Army in Afghanistan, people thought that it was defeated and collapsed over 1 week, 2 weeks at the end. It didn't. It was collapsing for months and months before that. And if you look at the military now, it's in small units spread all over the country, not being properly supplied, and it's slowly starting to fall apart. I think we also have to give credit. The resistance is now able to attack military bases. They're able to engage entire units in extended firefights. This is not just hit and runs and it's over. So the military has, they've started a fire that they can't put out. And they're in an incredibly bad position. I think what the world has to be better at, though, is that we know that the military, this is the same military that we say committed genocide. If that's the case, why are we so unable to take stronger action to support the resistance? I see no value in trying to mediate between these two sides. Pick the one that's right. That's the resistance. Help them win so we can be rid of this toxic military that's been so devastating to the country, but it's been an embarrassment to Southeast Asia for decades. Just pick the right side and support the resistance, and this can be ended sooner than later. I think what we can expect, the worst thing is that the poorer they do militarily, the more they're going to attack civilians, the more barbaric the military is going to be, and we have to continue to call that out. I think even more bluntly. I hope ASEAN can do that more bluntly, because I mean this is a regime that's just going to continue to attack civilians. So overall, I mean, yes, I do think the military can be defeated. I think that can happen sooner than later. I hope in 2022. And if you look at the ground game, what I call the tactical ground game, they're losing. So yes, thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marano. I also want to stress your point about the ethnic forces being lumped into the term called EAOs, ethnic armed organizations. But your point is that more of them, some of them are more significant than others, and the ones you mentioned, the Karen National Union (KNU), Kachin Independence Army (KIA), Karenni National Progressive Party (KNPP). So these are more significant ethnic forces, ethnic armies. One last minute of remarks from you, Gwen. Moving forward, what should we be expecting, prepared for, and where is this going? 2022 now.
Just from a fascinating, so I've just been sitting interviewing a lot of people over the last few weeks for, the coup anniversary coverage. So my head's almost spinning with the range of views. I broadly agree with the other speakers, Kinonma and Matter, in terms of the visions and the idea of unity and victory and the shift in the mindset. But actually, I do have to say, I think one big question that hangs, I think, is what the definition of victory or defeat is. When I asked a lot of people, what's your definition of victory? There's a huge split in between people. I'm not saying a hostile split. I'm just saying a divergence of views in people who really feel that victory would be weakening the Tatmadaw, the military, enough to come to the negotiating table and to negotiate something, because realistically, what are you going to do with 250 to 300,000 soldiers, even if you decapitate men online? You're left with this structure. It does require some negotiation. On the other hand, I've interviewed a lot of people who say no negotiation, we'll fight to the end and we'll oust them. In other words, the kind of takeover Naypyidaw scenario. So I think that's really something to think about. I just didn't get a clear idea of how well thought through this might be.
Yes, and this is the issue about the opposition coalition's unity and solidarity and common objective, and a shared vision for Myanmar's future. I think it's still on the table and ongoing. Thank you, Gwen. Ambassador Kasit, what should Thailand, ASEAN be doing, expecting this year? I mean, 2022, big year for Cambodia, a very vulnerable, challenging year for ASEAN. What should we be anticipating?
I expect Indonesia to take the lead from now on, because next year Indonesia will take over the chairmanship, and then Indonesia, from what I heard, has already been thinking in a more constructive and proactive manner. That's the first point. Second, what Indonesia or the other ASEAN could do from now on, I think, is to work closely with the World Bank, IMF, and UNDP. I think they should set up a sort of a Marshall Plan, because I know that at the International Finance Institute, there is 800 million US dollars available for Myanmar. So that could be a sort of a seed money, and we could, the UN and the World Bank could, together with ASEAN, solicit for more contribution. So we should set a sort of a Marshall Plan for the, I think, rehabilitation and redevelopment of Myanmar. I think that could be done in parallel with, I think, the peace settlement for whatever it is and so on. But I do agree with the assessment of Arnold in the sense that I think the military action by the junta is not viable. I think I am not a military man, but by the sense of it, once you have that political will of the people, and the resistance is countrywide, no army, no military thing could sustain itself. But what would happen? I think it will be an internal collapse inside the junta. And I think once the collapse, then I think the resistance force, together with some of the positive army leaders and so on, can sit down and forge a new future of Myanmar, because there is already some, I think, what do you call it, inside the constitution. I think the military side, the remaining military people, the more progressive one, could have a look at it, and I think they could have a national consensus and start the country going again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to everyone for exceeding time by a few minutes. I'll just bring this to a close by saying that what happens in Myanmar's political future is not just about Myanmar. I think it also has broader lessons and example for the wider world. This fight within the country about democracy, military dictatorship is a crucial fight, not just for the country itself, but also for the wider world. Thank you to all the speakers. Kinoma, I know it's a late hour where you are, and Dr. Mar, I know it's a very early hour where you are. Thank you very much for joining us. And to the senior fellows of ISIS, thank you very much, Gwen Robinson, Basa Kasip Pirom. This event has been recorded, so it will be available, and I suspect that there will be a lot of people who will tune in and listen subsequently. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to our audience, viewers, listeners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ajahn.
Thank you, Ajahn.
Okay.